All right, hello there. I'm going to just start right into this or get right into it. I've got a copy of the document over here on the right, underlining the chapter that I'll be reading. It looks about 10 or 11 pages. I'm not going to go through too many of the footnotes. This chapter also includes, I think, 3 diagrams as well as some icons that have been used to further illustrate the author's points. And you're better off trying to get a hold of the document from the CIA CREST library in terms of understanding it versus me trying to explain the drawings. While the diagrams and drawings make sense in context of this chapter, it's not particularly easy to walk through it verbally, hoping that someone will understand it. However, the video, you can pause the video as well and review the diagrams that way. Okay, so chapter 1, extrasensory perception, parentheses, primary communication, exit parentheses, and explanatory observation of the nature and structure of PSI, in capital letters PSI. An explanatory observation, the nature and structure of PSI. In the past few years, fundamental changes have taken place in our understanding of ESP. The old mind-to-mind communication concept of telepathy has been supplanted by a new model which emphasizes the oneness of the sender and receiver. American experimenters Clive Baxter and Eldon Bird, as well as Soviet researchers V.N. Pushkin and V.M. Feddersen, have been able to demonstrate that between man and plants a bond can form which makes the plant, in a sense, an appendage of the man, a part of him. This unitary existence is so intimate that if the man is seriously injured, even at a distance the plant will show a measurable heightened response at the moment of injury. The results of these experiments are reported to be repeatable with a high degree of consistency. It seems that the humble plant more than establishes the validity of ESP phenomena as a basic unitary communication. We have a footnote there, a reference number at the end of communication, and that's Baxter Clive, Evidence of Primary Perception in Plant Life, International Journal of Psychology, Volume 10, Number 4, Winter 1968, pages 329 through 348. Then we have Hashimoto Ken. I'm going to pronounce this Koshingaki Nyomon. Japanese work on psychic research, Tokyo 1964. And then we have a reference to V.N. Pushkin, UN, in parentheses, I guess the paper or title would be called Flower Recall. Ananya Silla, November 1972 in Russia. New paragraph. Such results have given researchers a deep insight into human ESP. ESP seems to take place at the deepest levels of human awareness and communication. It appears that there are roughly 7 levels of human communication depth, which we may rank as to increasing intensity and increasing risk to self. So following this paragraph is a table, and it's divided into 2 columns and 7 rows. And the first column is called activity type, and the second column is called risk to self. And what we're looking at essentially is a few data points on using the ability and then the percentage of risk to yourself or myself or whomever self references here. The first row is cliche, in parentheses, merely a recording. Exit parentheses, and they say the risk to self there is 5%. The second row is reporting history or dry data with little personal material included. Risk to self 10%. Reporting or others, risk to self 20%. Reporting own thoughts 40%. expressing feelings, because so much of a person is involved with this feelings, it is no wonder that mental illness always includes emotional illness, 70%. Sharing the most intimate experience, dreams, hunches, ESP visions, poetry, diary, etc. Risk to self, 80%. Sharing whole self, total empathy with the other to the extent that what happens to you happens to him, at oneness, 100%. New paragraph. Each of these levels seem to deepen in the level of consciousness as it deepens in intensity of communicative bond. It also appears that as the bonding intensifies, the relationship between time and space becomes more dense and concentrated. Surface time is that conceived of by man as a unit of measurement which proceeds from the now instant, backwards into past and forward into future. As the level of human consciousness deepens, the past and future appear to be constricted into a now, which includes both future and past. Such ambiguities beneath the surface of things are not new to the physicist. He would consider it most inappropriate for one to ask where an electron is at any particular moment in its orbit. It seems that one model of consciousness, time, and space reality in deepening levels of intensity would look like so. And then we have a diagram, a hand drawing here. And in the center is now. Then there's another circle outside of that divided into thirds. And it's at oneness, dense, and then most. And then another circle divided into thirds, deeper, closer, more dense, and then a last an all-encompassing circle around all of those, divided into thirds, surface consciousness, surface time, and surface space. I'm not going to try to decipher any of that. I'll just move on to the next paragraph. What all of this means is that when a person or living thing of any kind is threatened, and that person or living thing is close to you, you are also feeling the threat at the same instant, because in a sense, you are that person by empathy, or you are a new unitary being which includes both you as participating organs, includes both of you as participating organs. The information of threat first enters the receiver where it is felt first, which is where the person is most at one with the other. One model of the event might look like this. And then we have two diagrams. There's a consistent use of threes. In this one, we're using the triangle to represent, I think, what's known as the median curve, and they're just using triangles to represent it. So they have two diagrams that essentially, okay, I'll explain this one. Represents the threat of as the threat develops, then somehow that threat is transmitted through energy, and the person you're most close with experiences it or receives it and becomes aware of it. And then there's the second diagram, which posits it's a precognitive event whereby you're aware of the threat, and then it follows the same procedures again. The energy is transferred somehow to your unitary bond partner, and or they perceive it cognitively, precognitively. The next paragraph or next sentence, the ending sentence is, the united awareness observes a surface future threat in the now and passes it upward. The fact that these models have some validity is indicated by all known accounts of ESP. Ancient or modern indicate that it took place as a dream, hunch, or vision, the accepted language of the deep consciousness. Russian, European, and American experimenters all acknowledge that over 90% of known ESP spontaneous episodes take place between close friends or the members of a family. Talented sensitives are aware that they have an uncanny ability to emphasize or absorb others. See Chapter 1, Appendix Summary of an Extrasensory Event to illustrate stages of the developing relationship bond. The scriptures and wisdom literature of all major cultures consistently associate these ESP powers with deepening capabilities of at-oneness. In Christian scripture, this is particularly evident in John's Gospel, chapter 14 to 17, and in Paul's letter of the Corinthians, chapters 12 to 14. Much the same outlook is evidenced in the work of Chuangzi, the Taoist, the writings of the Muslim Sufis, the Jewish Hasidism, and the Zen masters. Most writings emphasize the great danger of concentrating on acquiring powers rather than improving the bonding capability out of which all power comes in their view. It appears that by concentrating principally on at-oneness, we are merely putting things in their proper perspective. Dr. Einstein noted that nothing exists by itself, that all things exist in relationship with something else. Although it is often not taken this way, it is evident that Dr. Einstein is referring to an absolute reality. The relationship underlined. Existence is not possible without it. Unless a proper relationship exists between the parts, not even our bodies can function. If one organ or function is given too much emphasis, the whole system goes out of balance and a degenerative relationship begins. This is no less true with ESP. If only the ESP aspect of a person is deepened, the whole psychological structure becomes unbalanced and severe mental illness results. One of the principal reasons ESP has been shunned in the past by orthodox science is that it appeared to conform to few known scientific laws. But of course, this is not so. It conforms as we observe with the principal law or absolute of the at-oneness relationship. As the intensity of the multi-level bond increases between people, a deeper relationship of at-oneness exists until the two have become a kind of new unitary being, or a single field entity. This being has a kind of unitary mind, which knows what is happening to both participants at the same time. This knowledge takes place at the deep level of the now world, which is beyond time and space as we know it in the surface world. How does the relationship look in a simplified sketch? This is a rhetorical question, and it's followed by a drawing of an ankh and the yin-yang symbol. For over 4,000 years, man has attempted such a sketch. The Egyptians say ankh, the egg of life entering outward structure. The Chinese observed the male substance yin, A, filling in the female container, B, and all things in a state of energy flux between being filled and emptied, but all were one in this relationship. Binary math used the 0 and 1 in much the same way. The 19th century Hegel added the concept of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, but his was a world in conflict. The thesis and antithesis were destroyed in the forming of the synthesis. In the model of the atom, modern physics has given us a glimpse of the fully balanced interpretive relationship. The proton, neutron, and electron share one another, experience one another, and continue to exist as separate entities while still forming a new entity, the atom. This model seems to work for all known relationships. If we see the neutron as the intermediate zone or buffer or partner of interface, the relationship would look something like so. Thing or state, an icon of a plus symbol, which is more attracted to thing or state, icon of a minus symbol, which is less or complementary. To facilitate exchange of output, they form a buffer or mixture, plus which is also assures the contained separate existence. In a balanced relationship, the plus becomes another partner in a new entity, forms at the next highest level of being. I'm going to stop and pause for a minute. So that paragraph is accompanied with some icons of the plus and minus symbol. And the last icon shows two plus symbols and a minus symbol circled by an all-encompassing circle. Next paragraph. As the atom is real with traits of its own, so is the human entity of relationship to the family. As the atom forms compounds, so families form tribes and nations, as these are real entities with perhaps a consciousness of their own. To illustrate further, when we see the child as a bond between the mother and father, it is not too hard to understand that half of his genes come from mother and half from father. Nor is it unexpected that his principal character traits come from the two parents, but the relationship is subtle. A participant is at one level and in one direction, while at the same time he is in another and in another. Because all entities are continually being fertilized by all other participants, their identities continually change and are created anew. As the ESP effect is observed to be in direct proportion to the intensity of the multi-level bond between persons, then the principal effort in developing talented people should first concentrate on their ability to form deep multi-level balanced bonds. The whole person must be developed at the deeper level. An unbalanced emphasis on only the ESP faculty often leads to severe neurosis or psychosis, according to Menninger Institute psychologists and parapsychologists alike. Such unpredictable people are untrustworthy to themselves, their families, and to the intelligence community. It is more than a cliche that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. For the intelligence community to be able to use such people in relative safety, they must be developed ethically and morally as they are psychically. Or we might as well forget need to know and compartments. This calls for an inner discipline of the whole man which goes far beyond the rationalized, ritualized, mass-produced religion we are all familiar with. It is no coincidence that the growth and development of meditative and contemplative disciplines has taken place concurrently with the development of national interests in ESP. It appears that the person who wants to develop those deeper insights and powers must experience that which is, 1, complete and whole, or become unbalanced. This development seems to take place best in the believing community. This is not just a community that believes in strange phenomena, but a group of people strong enough to relax in one another's presence. This group of people would be courageous enough to accept themselves and others for what they are and allow others to be what they are, trusting that any talent or capability emerging in the person who is trustworthy will be of value to the community. These are persons who trust what they experience because they trust in their own integrity as persons. So there's an appendix to this, and I'm just going to talk through what I'm looking at. If you're watching this and not listening, you can read through this interview. It's basically a lawyer known as Mr. DF is asking Mrs. Barbara about the details of an accident through a researcher. Essentially, there's a summary of this, and I'll just read that. Harry Gross had a similar experience, as did Wolf Messing of the Soviet Union, a surprising admission coming from a communist. He stated that as a teenager he was very devout and had a religious experience. After that, he had always been able to do such things as mind clouding and clairvoyance. All three of these people claim a very idealistic relationship with their God and other men. Does this form of disinterested relationship yield the greatest information about the other because it encourages the greatest access and flow with the other? It is consistently reported that it does. So this interview is about a woman who is contradicting a police report whereby she was able to figure out that the officer was either lying or misrepresenting the facts, and the lawyers later found out that she was correct. So that's the end of this chapter. I've made a few underlines. If you're watching, you saw it occur live. I'm going to go back and just add some commentary to some of this. For me, it's personally concerning that they consider this to be a mental illness in the workplace if you're able to read your coworkers. I think that is probably why most people in a corporate environment now are basically either using a machine, which is a computer, to text, and a gaming theory, which was developed at least in the 30s or 40s by the military and studied by the military, but using gaming theory and gaming mechanics, which is basically the same as likes and dislikes and stuff like that, to essentially disassociate entirely from the human connection. I don't think that it's the opposite, where some people argue it's strengthening the human connection by using this technology. It did for me because I didn't become involved with the internet because I needed to connect with people. I became involved with the internet because I immediately saw the ability to connect to new information, not people. So, and I ultimately saw it as a tool, right? The computer was a tool, sort of an extensible tool of the mind in order to create, to manifest, to make, to build, as well as just basically uninhibitedly learn new things. That has since changed. I think anybody that's listening to this or reading this and familiar with the internet in contemporary standards, it's really censored, filtered, and aggregated. There is not a sense of discovery at all, and that goes the same with. I would apply that statement to parallel the experience within the corporate world, because you don't learn and grow. I was once given some advice where once you stop learning, it's time to move on. What I found within the last few years is that there is no real learning. You're basically given a box to sit in, and that's where you sit. And if you attempt to break that box, either by introducing new lines of thought or helping others to achieve greater mobility within their own box, you're immediately shunned. You're immediately put down and sort of given busy work and things like that. Just to address these two statements here that I've underlined on screen: sharing the most intimate experience, dreams, hunches, ESP visions, poetry, diary, etc. That's 80% risk to self. The only reason anything like that would be a risk to self is because someone else abuses that information. I mean, I'm not sure how that correlation hasn't been made or why it wasn't made. It could be in other papers. It isn't. I've read many documents from the declassified set of documents available on the CIA CREST library. There's nothing related to that. In most cases, in even this document itself, you get the sense that there are multiple authors. In some senses, it's contradictory, which I'll approach, which I'll state or show in some later pages within this chapter. But it's clear that what happened here is what happens in most corporate environments, is that it's a division of the mind, whereby you write something, you don't get to fully write it. You'll never get to fully express your own thoughts. But if you do write something that's fully expressed, it's disseminated across the board of other people, and they begin to edit and pick and pull it apart. And a common term that's used in the corporate world is called a living document. It's like, let's create a living document, and we'll just update that document as it goes. And what really happens is well, because this document references communists a little bit, and they're surprised that a communist would admit to something, what it does is it doesn't democratize the thought. It puts it into a communistic mindset. So if you have an idea, and that idea immediately becomes the property of other people, and then they're allowed to contribute or add and subtract, which is really what it is. They add and subtract. We shouldn't say contribute, because contribute, I think, implies a positive or negative influence, whereas add or subtract really removes the emotional component and puts it back into a psychotic state where there's not even necessarily a correlation to the original idea. There's just people adding and subtracting, which isn't positive. That doesn't really, it reduces stream of consciousness, whereby the idea can be understood as a whole, and it increases cognitive dissonance, whereby the idea becomes so abstract. Individuals might grab one paragraph and literally, absorb that only paragraph and just move on from there, and never really make the effort to finish the document or finish the idea or finish the thought. And another version of that, or another way to explain that, is what some people used to call the 5-minute bullet list, where that's all you get. That's all you get from whatever's going on. And that doesn't breed any real critical thinking. That actually just makes people, I guess, fundamentalists, where they really don't grasp what they're passing on to other people or what they're sharing, nor do they really understand the reflection of what they contribute. So if they take that living document and they start adding things to it, they're not going back to look at how it really fits within the whole, or how it may be interpreted on the outside. That's a dangerous modality of thinking, I think, in my opinion. Excuse me. Sharing whole self, total empathy with the other to the extent that what happens to you happens to him, at oneness. Risk to self is 100%. So after reading that, we might say that the risk to self column maybe implies security, where what the author is trying to communicate is that any sensitive who's working in the field, and when I say that, I don't mean a spy, I don't mean an agency person, but any one of us, any of us working somewhere, sharing, like I just said previously, is really a matter of trust, and the only danger is in how someone else may abuse that. So it's kind of counterintuitive, whereby your ability would increase as a sensitive and your skills would increase as a sensitive when you feel comfortable with the people you're around, including your family or coworkers or friends. However, you're at 100% risk now for doing so. So I really don't understand how this mental illness thing comes in. I think the mental illness comes in whereby if you're a manager and someone can tell that you're lying or you're misrepresenting facts, that's going to create an issue for you at the workplace. I still don't see how that's a mental illness unless you're the manager and you hold the powers to this person's position or the powers to this person's mobility within the company or whatever. You just kind of hold the power over some people, and you don't want anybody knowing that you're lying or misrepresenting something or keeping things from the individual or group. So using their terminology in this document, compartments, the whole idea of things being compartments is not security. Secrecy is not security. That doesn't make any sense. Oftentimes, expounding and sharing it creates a greater sense of security, because the more people that know something, the less people can hide it, right? Or the less people become subject to the ill effects of the secrecy. I mean, that's just an opinion. I'm sure that could be argued or has been argued before by much more experienced people, but I don't make that correlation that the author makes like that. In Christian, let me read this. I'm moving on to the next page, the next underline I have. So in this sentence, in Christian scripture, this is particularly evident in John's Gospel, chapter 14 to 17, and in Paul's letter of the Corinthians, chapters 12 to 14. Much the same outlook is evidenced in the work of the Taoists, the Muslim Sufis, the Hasidics, and the Zen masters. For anybody who's not familiar with Sufis, that's sort of the most Christian version of Islam. Those guys and girls, I don't know how many women are Sufis, but the Sufis are considered the more philosophical, spiritual, and alchemical versions of the Islamic religion and Muslims in general. Hasidics tend, in my experience, in my opinion, same with the Sufis, but in my opinion, Hasidism is the alchemical and psychological addition within Judaism. And the Zen masters they are the spiritual and physical sort of representation, I guess, or mastery. So in a way, you kind of have these religions that all exist with little parts and parcels of various ascension methods. I've read John's Gospel. I've read Corinthians. I don't know them offhand. I would have to reference them again to see if what the author is saying is codification or subtext and things like that. But for them to reference this, I think there's a bias right there. Ultimately, without being able to reference Islamic writings, Jewish writings, or Zen writings. So they only essentially read and referenced the Christian scriptures as a way to reinforce their point. So that's a bit of bias there. I'm moving on to the next underline. So Dr. Einstein, so this sentence here, Dr. Einstein noted that nothing exists by itself, that all things exist in relationship with something else. It's my understanding that Einstein tried to bury and refute what's known as the ether or the aether, the concept of the aether. So if the author is using Einstein as a reference point here, this sentence to me stipulates that Einstein was referencing the ether. Some people, I guess, call it dark matter or may presume it to be dark matter, but other people, I think, have shown it's not electromagnetism, it's not dark matter. There is an ether or an aether. So there's a bit of confabulation, or just maybe the author's not aware. If only the ESP aspect of a person is deepened, the whole psychological structure becomes unbalanced and severe mental illness results. That's a tough sentence to swallow, because let's use someone else's statement. I'm going to quote a media and publishing personality known as Graham Hancock. He's on record as saying that Neanderthals were most likely using ESP before writing and language developed. And when you hear that statement, you're like, well, of course they were. I mean, how else would the hive mentality work? How else would the pride or the herd be able to communicate unless they were communicating electrobiologically or through some sort of ESP, or maybe sharing a sense of danger, kind of like a school and fish who all swerve at the same time. That is a sense of oneness that the author references. So if we got here by way of usage of ESP, I'm not sure how using it in full capacity is a mental illness. In fact, what it continues to make me think is that the author is terrified of it, is scared of it. Now, I understand that the author is part of the NSA, or an independent researcher contractor associated with the NSA, and their idea of secrecy is that whatever they're doing can't be known by other people. So that's where they're drawing this fear from. But to posit that or surmise their entire belief system or security structure, rather, saying that anyone that uses it or is able to use it 100% or has only developed that capacity would be a mental illness. I don't believe that. That's not fair to anybody, actually, since there's enough research to show that children exhibit most of these things early on. And their own research later, as I do more of these videos and recordings, they started using children, because they were more receptive to the idea. So to this author's point where they said you have to feel comfortable with the people you're around and who you're with, and really embrace the whole concept of what you're being tested for and what you're being told you can do or what you believe you can do. This is completely contradictory. So especially when you have to use children who won't share the biases of an adult, the pre-programmed predispositions of an adult, unless of course they've been abused or been already been trained by parents and families. So that's not a good way to surmise an ability to a group of security individuals or high-level individuals who seem to follow their religion almost exclusively and are really putting that kind of perspective over the top of this. And also there's an underlining thought throughout all of this document whereby they don't stipulate it, they don't say it, they don't state it, but it's kind of like the whole thing's positioned like we discovered ESP when we know that's not the case, and even their own papers and research say that most likely everybody uses it. 1% of the population actively uses it. So they didn't discover anything, so they shouldn't be able to govern it, right? Nor should they be putting the lens on it that we have to hinder it or secure it or teach others how to use it when we ourselves are terrified of it ultimately. That doesn't make for a good teacher, does it? All right, so I've underlined. I'm going to the next underline. I'm going to cut this short in about 5 or 6 minutes. I'll try to get through these last couple of underlines. So the yin-yang symbol in the Ankh, I just want to add on this note that the yin-yang symbol is not the male and the female. That is a constant interpretation or a persistent interpretation solely from Catholicism and Christianity, derived from the Holy Trinity. The notion of the Trinity as it relates to even the nuclear family, which of course I all support those things, but this symbol itself is the sin wave. It's an inversion of one thing and the other. It is not a binary symbol. The yin-yang symbol is representative of most likely the Asian knowledge of somatics as well as the seasons, and that's what we're really looking at here. It's not, in my opinion, in my interpretation of those documents and those symbols related to the yin-yang, it has nothing to do with the male and the female. That's a purely binary interpretation. Moving on to the next underline, if there is one. Okay, the Menninger next underline is, I'll read the full sentence again. An unbalanced emphasis on only the ESP faculty often leads to severe neurosis and psychosis, according to Menninger Institute psychologists and parapsychologists alike. That has a reference number. John Peterson, Science and Psychic Power, The National Observer, October 20th, 1973. So if that research has already existed, and again I'm going to use their own research, it shows that most likely from a federally budgeted or government budgeted standpoint, most of these studies really started in the 20s and 30s. That is to exclude the studies of independent researchers, I'll call them, from the 1800s and 1700s, who have all published work of their own regarding telepathy and psychogenesis, which is another form of saying telekinesis. So you have telekinesis, telepathy, and I don't ever see it mentioned, but the often believed spontaneous combustion or psychokinesis, which I think is starting fire with your mind. Excuse me. Psychokinesis again is not mentioned in here. I don't recall seeing anything about starting mind fires or spontaneous combustion, but a lot of those notions were referenced earlier in the 1800s and 1700s via a lot of research. There's a lot of people who, in New York City, there were a lot of hospitals that were running their own independent archive and research facilities where they were testing this kind of thing. Basically sensitives and telekinesis and psychokinesis. So I think that people have to address that first before they make a quick reference to the National Observer. Again, this whole concept of unbalanced, it's not unbalanced if you can tell someone's lying to you or feel like they're lying to you. Now, I think the unbalanced equation or the unbalanced feeling, let's call it that, would be, say you have an attraction to someone and you just can't stop thinking about them and you're constantly entering that person's mind. This is completely hypothetical, but I mean, based on what they're saying and their fears, this may be a thought that they consider. So sexuality, again, becomes an issue for people, and that's kind of sad. Especially when you're a group of people who, what appears to me, work day and night, completely focused on one objective, and with no sexual desire or output. I find you are actually the unbalanced one, right? If you're not able to express those things or receive those things in the natural meaning or the natural order in which they're presented. So in the natural order and meaning, I'm suggesting that ESP is the agency of all of us, and that if someone feels an attraction, that's just a natural occurrence. So if you're not able to deal with those things in a meaningful way, you yourself technically are the unbalanced one. While this document sort of posits that anybody who's a good receiver or receptor or a strong projector of these abilities has a mental illness, right? That's sort of, I'm just offering that perspective on this and overlaying it because I think it's worth pointing out. Moving on to the next underline. This development seems to take place in the believing community. This is not just a community that believes in strange phenomena. That right there, I think, for anybody who's religious or non-religious, you should immediately equate, or I hope you would immediately equate praying, right? Whether praying with a group in unity or praying with yourself to your own respective God or gods. I think that's also a great representation of manifest destiny, where whether or not you were precognitive about it, your ability to put your thoughts out there in a positive way and to share that same thought with other people, at least from an intent standpoint, may be a good proof of both precognitive ability, whereby someone else receives that, excuse me, or manifest destiny, as that's the best term to use for now. I also just want to add in there that there's a reason why churches have the type of architecture they used to have, especially the Gothic churches, which for some reason are looked down upon or sort of equated with demonology or Satanism. I think if you're going to start reading this stuff or participating in these videos in any way, you should sort of eliminate that from your modality of thinking long enough to recognize that the things that are occurring in these documents are because of people, not demons or not Satan. There are doctors, physicists, researchers, analysts, psychologists. These are whatever good or bad comes of all this can be discriminately attributed to a person or many persons. So put that stuff on the back burner for now, in the back of your head at the lowest portion, and just kind of sit on the factual surface, which is the attribution of the authors, the researchers, the analysts, and the psychologists, the military personnel, and the people that are involved in the experiments, for good or bad. I think that it's important to stay there as you go forward. The last underline on that page that corresponds with the believing community underline. These are persons who trust what they experience because they trust in their own integrity as persons. That, for me, I think further supports my statement considering the believing community, but it does not negate evil intent, because I really hate to use pop culture as a reference. I don't want to do it because I don't want people's mind wandering or having to go reference pop culture. But, you know, the argument could be made, say, for Star Wars, the famous trilogy of Jedis. The argument could be easily made and easily portrayed in a different light if you followed the path of a stormtrooper, you know, entering the military, you know, because they believed in the Republic. So that person would have integrity in their beliefs and their experiences, and in fact would then be capable of the same ability. So let's just add one little layer to that, and just I'm going to use the word programming. All of us have it. We've either programmed ourselves. People have, you know, as this document has said, other people contribute to us. We add and subtract. We add and subtract. We're constantly in beta, moving forwards and backwards between the experiences that we live and the contributions that people have made to us. You know, we're all part of the people we care about and have experienced, for better or for worse. So whatever programming we have, this does not negate that, this statement. These are persons who trust what they experience because they trust in their own integrity as persons. So it doesn't matter if you're good in the perspective of the author. It doesn't matter if you're a good person in the perspective of the judges who allowed patents to be made, or you know, whatever the case is. It's how you believe in yourself. So if you're, you know, if you're on the side of the Sith, obviously the Sith can use the same gift, and they do, as you know, per the movie. So moving on from pop culture, let's just continue on. I think that is the last underline for this chapter. All right, so the next chapter in the next video will be chapter 2, how to safely develop ESP through the organism type, the believing community. All right, have a good day, everyone.